Coming up on this special SUTV presentation, the portrayal of African Americans in the news, why minority reporting is seen as too negative, and can adding color to the newsroom add balance to minority reporting? It's all right now. Welcome. In the past, TV news has been the most trusted source for information. Today, that trust is declining.
I like to play selective with what I believe in the news.
Other students said they don't trust just TV news. They'll check several other online sources before believing a television news story. Mary Butler is an even bigger skeptic when it comes to how much broadcast news she trusts.
I'd say probably about 50% of it. I have to research it first, though.
According to Gallup.com, last year, overall trust in mass media was at an all-time low. Strong political leaning was the top reason. Errors in reporting make the list too.
You see it every time there's a huge news event, especially on Twitter. Everyone's like, I have to be the first to report this, even if it's wrong. Like with the Navy Yard shooting, they found that guy's ID, and they're like, oh, he's the shooter. No, he was the guy who dropped his ID.
One local journalist is doing her part to maintain viewer trust.
I do my best in my everyday life to be truthful and upfront and honest with the facts that I report. I leave my opinions at the door.
While errors do happen, major broadcast news stations, as well as SUTV News, spend hours upon hours meeting, rehearsing, researching, and fact-checking in order to report the most accurate news.
And I'm Mark Campbell.
In addition to trust, today we're exploring diversity in the news. Study after study after study shows while African Americans make up 13% of the American population, we, and non-European Americans overall, are significantly underrepresented in the news. The argument is why and how African Americans are underrepresented. The Radio Television Digital News Association reported this year that nearly 79% of the television news force is European American. African Americans make up only 10% of the newsroom employees. We'll discuss if this statistic is truly relevant to how and how much non-European Americans appear in the news. You can join in the conversation on Twitter using hashtag #WhiteAndBlackNews. Now let's jump right in and meet our guests. Dr. Kim Garris, who worked for 16 years in television news before becoming associate professor in the Communication Journalism Department and SUTV advisor here at Shippensburg University.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me too.
And then we have Dr. Mizadul Biswas, also in the Communication Journalism Department, is an assistant professor specializing in new media and public relations with an interest in media diversity. Criticism among African American consumers is we, news media professionals, find poor representation of the public and put them on TV. The recent and most notable are Antoine Dotson, whose sister there was attempted rape, Sweet Brown, whose apartment building was on fire, and Charles Ramsey, who found the missing girls in Ohio. Our own Tu-Nung hits the streets to find out what you think.
According to a 2012 poll on stateofthemedia.org, African Americans consume more TV news than Latinos and Caucasians, but they are dissatisfied with what they are seeing. What do you think? When you see African Americans on the news, how do you feel they are portrayed?
When I saw that Antoine Dotson video, I just assumed like that's how he acts, and that's not how they usually act. So I mean, it doesn't really there's stereotypes and stuff, but you don't really assume that's how people act when it's just one person.
Depending upon the situation, I think it's a lot of negativism on the perspective of different views, because we're already stereotyped anyway, so it depends upon the issue.
Well, I typically feel like the media portrays African Americans as one general population, and we don't always get to see each person for who they are and what they have to offer, so then that's generalizing the whole population.
I feel like in some sense we're portrayed basically how the media
like wraps around to portray us. Kind of like how like Sweet Brown or Anton Dobson. I don't blame them for, being asked a question. If they were there at the scene of the crime and it happened in this underserved area, that's just the type of people that live there.
We were lucky enough to get a sit down with local TV news anchor Sherry Christian. In her career, she says she seeks to find the most knowledgeable person at the scene, but this is not always the case in the experiences she's encountered.
There used to be a comedian that part of his stand-up was talking about how reporters would step over the black man in a suit carrying a briefcase to talk to the person that had maybe their hat turned around backwards and a cigarette behind their ear and missing some teeth. And he would say they would purposely seek out that person to interview, and that's who everybody would see representing that particular race. Yes, it was a comedy sketch. Sadly, though, I did see that sometimes when I was out and covering stories as a reporter.
So tell me, Dr. Garris and Dr. Biswas, what are your thoughts about how minorities are represented in the news? It's said that, news people go out and pick the most ignorant or unattractive people. So what do you have to say about that?
I think the source is very important, how source can frame and inform the news story and the content. So the background of the source is very important, how they are knowledgeable or not. They represent the educational status of the identity, ethnic identity, because the quality of information is important based on who is talking, who is informing the news.
Well, having been a journalist myself, I know how this process works. I even worked at the very station that Antoine Dodson was interviewed, the reporter interviewed him. And the truth is, Antoine Dodson was the expert in that case. Antoine's sister was attacked and almost raped. And when the reporter went to find someone to give her an up-close account of that, who better to be that person to tell the actual story than Antoine Dodson? What happened to Antoine Dodson had nothing to do with mainstream journalism. What happened to Antoine Dodson was the mashup in social media after the fact. Antoine Dodson told what he knew to be the truth. And wouldn't the claim be that we ignored Antoine Dodson as journalists if we didn't let him speak? I agree with Dr. Biswas. The source and the background of the source is very important, but I would say in the case of Antoine Dodson, he had the most background knowledge of that case of anyone there.
Now, in this example, we're just taking the most popular ones because they've been in the media so much.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you say to the fact that it seems to be that outside of those popular cases, that you don't really see the guy in the business suit carrying the briefcase, that Latino's not represented, that African American's not represented, what do you say about that?
And I was actually, when I was responding to the first question, and I was trying to focus on the trend. And the trend is very much that who are representing African Americans and Latinos. Are they with someone decision makers in the society or executives or the educated class of that community? So, and in contrast, what we see the European and non-European ethnic identities. If we do the content analysis, and most of the mass communication research have so far found in terms of source that in case of decision making or executive level or sources mainly come from the European background Americans.
And he's right, and he was speaking to the trends, and I was speaking to on the ground, when the rubber meets the road experience, which can jade what is the trend overall, for sure. And the statistics bear it out. There is no question there are less faces of color in the news in general. Part of it is the function of who is reporting and the time in which they have. That's not an excuse, but that's sort of what happens. You know, you've been out and tried to interview people, and for every one person that talks with you, 15 don't.
Right, that's very
so
true.
Sometimes it's just the person that you finally get to talk. Is that an excuse for not continuing on? No, it's not, but that's the reality sometimes. There's a troubling trend, I think, in journalism overall, in that, particularly in television journalism, it's very expensive to get an education in journalism, in anything, but it's very expensive to get an education, and then when you get out into your entry-level job, you can't pay the rent. The pay is so low to start out. It goes up quickly, but if you can't subsidize that entry-level job, then you're probably not going to get into the business, and that limits who gets in. And so in that case, who would get in?
Right, those who have
higher socioeconomic, which quite often end up being European or people of European descent.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. Now, I want to change gears just a little bit and take us to the next point. Another debate that is out there is that we should have more people of color in the newsroom to be able to better represent the population.
No need to debate that.
And do you think that that's true? Is that the answer?
I think the National Association of Broadcasters, or RTDNA, they also in the same survey mentioned that how many people of color in the news management positions, and because who sets the agenda for the news and who frames through the editing, who have the editing power. So that obviously, if we have more representation in that news management side, the editor, producer, then there will be, the news will get more perspective from minorities in the newsroom.
I agree with Dr. Biswas in principle. I also think there's another thing going on. I agree there should be more people of color in the newsroom. There should be greater representation in management of women as well. The statistics are abhorrent at best. And so there should be greater representation. But I think, having experienced the newsroom culture, I think what also happens is once you come into the newsroom and you start, you're a cub reporter and you're learning the ropes, you really get socialized into that way of thinking, and I'm not sure it matters what color you are once you get to management. You're all thinking the same way quite often. That's unfortunate, but that's quite often what happens. And I think also that goes back to what I was saying about who is it that actually manages to get into those entry-level positions. And then what happens is we have people of the very same intellectual plane. We don't have the intellectual diversity that I think we should have in newsrooms. Right. Color seems to be a surface way to determine diversity, but I think you and I are have much more in common intellectually than you and Antoine Dodson. Although if you're standing next to each other, who's going to say has more in common?
Right. And I agree with Dr. Gary's that experience is very important, socialization part, that what we bring into the newsroom. Color is not an issue there. Experience is also important.
I just want to throw out this statistic. RTDNA reports in 2013, only 21% of the entire TV news workforce is non-European, meaning Latino, Asian, and Black. Local news is even worse. There's only 8% minority percentage. That was kind of astounding to me when I found that.
And I think if you take some of the outliers out of that, it would be even worse. So if you take Detroit, help me out here, perhaps Chicago, where might be a very
New Orleans, high population or Los Angeles.
Where there's a high population of non-European persons. I think if you took them out, it would get worse.
Even worse. I agree with that. So I think that it's time that we add some diversity to the newsroom, intellectually and physically. All right. Earlier in the show, we looked at statistics noting that African Americans consume news at a higher rate than Americans overall. However, news media programming aimed specifically at African American audiences is rare and it's often short-lived. An example would be in October 2012, BET introduced Don't Sleep. It's a talk format news program hosted by former CNN journalist TJ Holmes. After 6 weeks, the Monday through Thursday half-hour show was changed to a weekly one-hour show, and by December, it was gone. Another example would be on the Oprah Winfrey Network. That's happened. When it comes to African-American geared television, why do you think it's failing? Why do you think that African-Americans need to be so entertained?
Oh, wow. Now you asked 2 questions.
Okay, we'll take them one at a time.
Hit it. No, you give me the hard one. Okay. So let's go one at a time. What was the first question again? Why do they last? Why are they such short-lived?
Yeah, why are they so short-lived?
Well, it's very expensive. Very, very expensive to start a program. The marketing alone can just envelop you. So I think getting something launched and for it to be successful. Do you know how many years it took CNN to break into the black? It was 5 years. And you know what finally broke it? The first Gulf War.
Wow.
So black or other Latino, whatever, non-white, non-European news programming aimed at those populations, they don't have those triggers that might launch it. And CNN is a general audience, and so it has more eyeballs that are already going to be going toward it. Now you're already slicing the pie really small. What's the population of non-European Americans at this point? It's 30-something percent.
36.6%.
Okay, that's still only a third of the eyeballs that you could possibly get.
Right.
So it's difficult to make money, and you have to make money.
And this is the challenge of, I believe, the ethnic media, BET, or African American oriented media, or Latino oriented media. They have one type of content strategy that is different from the general audience media like CNN or ABC, and so they also try to, like ABC and Univision is now partnering together to promote English language among the Latinos.
Fusion. The Fusion Network. Yeah.
Yeah, and here you see that there is a dependency going on between the mainstream media and ethnic media there because of the market issue.
And you brought up Fusion. I was actually online looking at their site last night, and I saw an article where I can't remember what the owner of the station is, but they have moved away from focusing just at the Latino population, and now they want to get a general population, partly because it was kind of frowned upon amongst the Latino population, but because a general audience brings more viewers, which brings more money.
And then it stops being ethnically oriented, and then you go back to the problem you had before. It's a vicious cycle.
Right. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Second Look. We've had a pretty heavy conversation today, but I want to lighten it up a little bit. Are you ready for some fun?
Okay. Yeah. I'm a little afraid of this.
Don't be afraid. All right, I just have a quick question. If you were not a professor here at the wonderful old Shippensburg University, what would you be? Dr. Harris, I'll let you go first.
Oh, that's easy. I would continue. I would be a reporter if I would. Yeah, I'm a storyteller. I'm a visual storyteller, and I would continue to be a visual storyteller. Although I quite often say to my husband that my next career is going to be lottery winner. So
I like that one. Okay. I'm coming back as your daughter. Dr. Biswas, how about you? What would you be?
I would be ending up working for an international nonprofit organization for their communication strategy position.
Very lofty goal.
Yeah. Making lots of money, right?
No, he said nonprofit.
I know.
But I can travel.
Yes, that's true. There you go. That's true. As for me, what would I be? I would probably be some international superstar, gracing the covers of magazines.
You're already a superstar, Leah.
Well, that's all the time we have tonight, folks. Keep tweeting and leave comments. Thank you for joining us. I'm Leah Jolan, and we'll see you next time on Second Look.
Whoever I end up picking to choose to interview, to make sure that they are somebody who's the best representative of that race that they are a part of. You don't always have that choice, though. I think diversity is the answer to many things, whether it be adding more women, adding more people with disabilities, adding more minorities, because in that way you get viewpoints and opinions that are diverse. Viewers are going to be afraid of people who they see committing crimes in the news. And it makes sense. If you see story after story after story of a young black man wanted for a crime in wherever you happen to be, stands to reason that you may develop a fear of young black men.